A half-carved giant lies sleeping in an Egyptian quarry. This is the story of the unfinished megastructures of the ancient world. Across continents and centuries, the most ambitious construction projects humanity ever conceived were simply stopped, leaving behind silent fields of half-raised columns and mountains of abandoned stone. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the hidden forces that can bring a civilization's greatest dream to a sudden, grinding halt. These sites are not failures. They are frozen moments in time, holding urgent clues to political revolts, economic collapse, and environmental disasters. Why would a society, after investing generations of labor and treasure, walk away from its defining monument? We will investigate iconic ruins from forgotten empires to decode their common patterns and unique catastrophes. What does an unfinished building tell us that a completed one cannot? These silent giants share a specific and haunting profile. To be considered one of these unfinished megastructures, a site must meet three key criteria. First, it must be monumental in scale, a project so vast it demanded the collective effort of an entire society, something intended to stand for the ages. Second, there must be undeniable evidence it was abandoned during active construction. This is not a temple worn down by centuries of wind and rain, or a palace burned in a later war. We are looking for the chisel marks left mid-stroke, the column drums stacked but never raised, the quarry where the final block was simply never cut free. The work stopped and no one ever returned to finish it. Third, for our journey, these stories belong to the ancient world, generally from a time before the year 500 of the Common Era, a period when the reasons for such a halt are often shrouded in deeper mystery. This distinction is crucial. A ruined castle tells us about decay, about the slow victory of nature over human endeavor, but an unfinished monument is a snapshot. It is a time capsule sealed at the exact instant of crisis. For archaeologists, these sites are priceless. A completed pyramid hides its secrets beneath polished limestone. But an unfinished one, it lays bare every step of the process. You can see the ramps of earth and rubble still leaning against its sides, revealing the engineering methods. You can find the workers' settlements, the tools left where they fell, telling a story of daily life and labor organization. Most importantly, the stone itself holds the moment everything changed. The chisel grooves simply end. The half-carved statue gazes blankly, forever waiting for the artist's final touch. In that abrupt silence, we are not just studying architecture. We are witnessing the precise moment a dream collided with an unforgiving reality and lost. So where do we find these frozen moments, and what stories do their stones whisper? These frozen moments leave behind a unique and telling signature. To walk through an unfinished site is to step onto a stage where the actors have just vanished, their props still in hand. The evidence is everywhere, written not in ink but in stone and earth. Look at the column drums, those massive cylindrical blocks meant to be stacked into towering pillars. In a finished temple, they are seamless, a perfect vertical line. But in an abandoned one, they lie scattered across the field like giant stone coins, still bearing the quarry's rough surface, never smoothed or fluted by the mason's chisel. You might see a half-carved relief on a wall, where the outline of a god or a king emerges from the rock face, only to fade back into blank stone, the sculptor's vision forever trapped halfway between idea and reality. Then there are the untrimmed masonry blocks called ashlars, piled near their intended location. Their edges are still rough, lacking the final dressing that would lock them perfectly against their neighbors. Abandoned toolkits of copper chisels, stone hammers, and measuring cords have been found, sometimes left in a worker's niche as if they'd return after a lunch break that never ended. Perhaps most evocative are the temporary ramps and construction roads. These are the skeletal frameworks of the project, made of packed earth, rubble, and timber. They snake up the side of a half-built pyramid or lead from a quarry to a temple foundation, and then they simply stop, a roadway to nowhere. These features are almost always erased once a building is complete, their purpose served. Their survival is proof positive that work ceased unexpectedly. This is the great paradox of these places. A finished monument is a masterpiece, but it hides its own creation. Its polished surfaces conceal the fingerprints of its makers. An unfinished site, however, is an open textbook on ancient engineering. Every mistake, every change of plan, every logistical challenge is preserved in plain sight. The ramp's angle reveals the math of moving massive weight. The tool marks show the exact technique for splitting granite. The layout of worker huts speaks to the social organization of labor. By studying what was left behind in the rush to leave, we gain a clearer, more honest understanding of ancient ambition than any final product could ever provide. And few places on Earth demonstrate this more perfectly than a lonely quarry in the Egyptian desert, home to the most famous unfinished monument of them all. Deep in the sun-baked granite quarries of Aswan, a monument's dream lies broken in the rock. This is the Unfinished Obelisk, a colossal stone needle that never saw the sky. It remains exactly where ancient workers left it, partially carved from the living bedrock of the quarry floor. If completed, it would have been the largest single piece of stone ever shaped by human hands, stretching nearly 140 feet in length and weighing an estimated 1,200 tons. Its intended destination was likely the great temple complex at Karnak, a gift from the powerful female pharaoh Hatshepsut to the god Amun. This was to be a statement in stone, a declaration of divine favor and royal authority that would pierce the heavens. But the stone itself had other plans. The story of its failure is etched into its surface. As workers painstakingly carved the obelisk shape from the granite, using only stone pounders and relentless effort, a fatal flaw appeared. A massive crack, a deep and jagged fissure, ran through the stone's heart. In an instant, generations of planning, months of backbreaking labor, and an unimaginable financial investment were rendered worthless. The obelisk was irreparably damaged. To continue would have been folly, risking the entire structure shattering during the delicate process of extraction, transport, or erection. The order was given to abandon it, and so they did, walking away from a project that represented the absolute pinnacle of their technological ambition. What makes the Unfinished Obelisk so profoundly instructive is its raw honesty. A successful obelisk, standing proud and polished, gives no hint of the staggering difficulty of its birth. This one shows us everything. We can see the precise methods used to separate it from the bedrock, with trenches carved around its perimeter just wide enough for a worker to stand in. We can see the tool marks from thousands upon thousands of blows with dolerite stone hammers. It is a masterclass in ancient engineering, frozen at its most vulnerable moment. But more than that, it speaks to the absolute limits of the possible. Egyptian stone working technology was a marvel of the ancient world, yet it operated at the very edge of material science. They were pushing granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, to its breaking point literally. There was no margin for error. A single hidden flaw in the stone, invisible until exposed by the carving process, could doom an entire decade's work. This monolithic gamble reveals a core truth about these megastructures. They were not just buildings, they were high-stakes experiments. The workers and engineers were navigating uncharted territory, scaling up processes to levels never before attempted. The Unfinished Obelisk is a monument to that risk. It is a testament to both breathtaking ambition and the unforgiving laws of physics. It shows us that even the most powerful empire, with all its resources and knowledge, could be humbled by a crack in the stone. This single failure, preserved for over 3,000 years, forces a haunting question. If a flaw in the material could stop the mighty Egyptians, what other, greater forces could bring an even larger empire's dreams to a standstill? The crack in the granite was more than just bad luck. It was a collision between ambition and reality, a lesson written in stone about the ultimate limits of ancient engineering. To understand why the work at Aswan stopped forever, we need to look closer at that fatal fissure. Experts have long debated its origin. One theory suggests it was a pre-existing, hidden flaw deep within the bedrock, a secret weakness that remained invisible until the obelisk was almost fully carved out. The stone, under the immense weight of its own mass, simply began to fail along this hidden fault line. Another, perhaps more telling theory, points to the extraction process itself. The workers were using a technique of pounding trenches around the obelisk with heavy stone balls. This created tremendous vibrational stress on the granite. It is possible that the relentless pounding, day after day, actually induced the crack, a stress fracture born from the very method of its creation. This turns the story from one of simple misfortune into a profound technical dilemma. The ancient engineers were operating at the very frontier of their knowledge. They were scaling up a process to a size never before attempted, and in doing so, they may have encountered a physical limit they could not foresee or overcome. The granite itself became the final, unyielding authority. Abandoning such a project was not a simple administrative decision. In the worldview of ancient Egypt, a pharaoh's construction projects were acts of divine duty, a sacred contract with the gods to maintain cosmic order or mat. To leave a monument to a god unfinished was a serious spiritual matter. It suggests that the practical reality on the ground, the irreversible flaw in the stone, the wasted resources, the impossible risk, simply outweighed even the divine mandate. The economic and logistical implications were staggering. Thousands of workers, their food and housing, teams of skilled artisans, and the entire administrative apparatus for moving a 1,200-ton stone hundreds of miles up the Nile, all of it had to be redirected or dissolved. The silence in the Aswan quarry after the last worker left speaks to a moment of sober recalculation. It tells us that even in a society driven by faith and royal command, there was a point where the engineers had to approach the throne and deliver the unthinkable news that this particular dream of stone was impossible. The gods would have to wait, but what happens when the dream is not stopped by a crack in the stone, but by a fracture in the society itself? When the cause of abandonment is not a technical failure, but a human one. High in the mist-shrouded cloud forests of northern Peru, a civilization built its fortress in the sky. This is Kuelap, the monumental stronghold of the Chachapoya people, often called the warriors of the clouds. Perched on a ridge over 9,000 feet above sea level, its colossal stone walls encircle an entire mountaintop, a city of hundreds of circular homes and temples that feels more like a part of the landscape than something built upon it. The scale is staggering, a testament to centuries of labor by a culture determined to carve out a kingdom in one of the most remote and defensible places on Earth. Yet within this seemingly impregnable fortress, there is a puzzle. Among the hundreds of completed structures, archaeologists have identified a specific, massive circular building, far larger than the typical family dwellings. Its foundation is laid, and the first several feet of its walls rise from the earth, but then the stonework simply stops. Around it, perfectly cut limestone blocks lie scattered in the grass, as if delivered for a final phase of construction that never began. The layout is clear, the intention obvious, but the walls never reached their intended height. The work ceased, and the stones were left where they fell. This is not decay from age or damage from conquest. This is abandonment in mid-creation. Why would a society, having already achieved the Herculean task of building this mountaintop citadel, suddenly stop work on a major new structure within its own secure walls? The remoteness of Kuelap makes the mystery deeper. This was not a city on a vulnerable plain, easily overrun by an invading army. It was a natural fortress protected by sheer cliffs and those towering perimeter walls that in places soar 60 feet high. The reason for stopping must have been something that penetrated those defenses, something that rendered the continued labor not just difficult but meaningless. The scattered stones and incomplete walls are a silent alarm, a clue that the greatest threat to the Chachapoya's dream was not an external enemy scaling the cliffs, but an internal crisis that could not be kept out by any wall. To understand what that crisis was, we must look beyond the fortress itself, to the moment this cloud forest kingdom collided with a storm from across the ocean. The walls of Kuelap could not hold back the tide of history. For centuries, the Chachapoya culture thrived in its mountain fortress, a world unto itself. But in the late 15th century, a new power descended from the southern highlands, the expanding Inca Empire. The Inca military machine was relentless, and even the formidable defenses of Kuelap eventually fell. The Chachapoya were conquered and absorbed into the vast Inca state. This was not necessarily a total destruction, but a profound disruption. The Inca practice was to forcibly relocate rebellious populations, a policy called mitima, to break their connection to their homeland and dilute their power. It is highly likely that significant numbers of Chachapoya people were uprooted from their cloud forest cities and sent to live in distant parts of the empire. This single policy would have had a devastating effect on a construction project. The skilled labor force, the community knowledge, and the very social cohesion needed to organize such a massive building effort were scattered across the Andes. The stones for that grand, unfinished building were not just left, they were orphaned. The people who understood their purpose were gone. Then, within a few decades, an even greater cataclysm arrived. Spanish conquistadors, armed with new weapons and unfamiliar diseases, reached the region. The societal fabric that had already been frayed by Inca rule was now torn apart entirely. The combined shock of conquest, epidemic illness, and forced cultural change represents a demographic and political catastrophe. In this light, the unfinished structure at Kuelap is not a mystery, but a monument to a shattered timeline. Construction did not stop because of an engineering mistake or a lack of will. It stopped because the society that conceived it ceased to exist in its original, functioning form. The labor was not redirected, it was dissolved. The builders were not called to another project, they were displaced or their lives were lost to the hardships of a collapsing world. This pattern is a stark contrast to the cracked obelisk in Egypt. At Aswan, the empire itself remained intact, able to walk away from a single failed project. At Kuelap, the entire civilization that built the fortress was overwhelmed. The unfinished building here is a fossil of a specific kind of disaster, one where the builders themselves are vanished by forces far greater than any stone wall could withstand. It raises a compelling question: what happens when the crisis is not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding change of heart? When a society simply decides, generation by generation, that its most sacred project is no longer worth the cost. The ambition of Rome knew no earthly bounds. In the Bekaa Valley of modern Lebanon, the ruins of the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek stand as one of the most audacious statements of imperial power ever conceived. Its foundation platform is a masterpiece of megalithic engineering, featuring 3 colossal stones known as the trilithon. Each one measures roughly 64 feet long, 14 feet high, and 11 feet deep, weighing an estimated 800 tons. The Romans moved these behemoths over half a mile and lifted them over 20 feet in the air, a feat that strains belief even with our modern understanding of physics. Yet to truly grasp the scale of Roman ambition, you must turn away from the finished temple and walk a few hundred yards to the south. There, in an ancient quarry, you find the dreams that even Rome could not lift. Here lies the true unfinished megastructure, not a building, but the raw material of a vision that outgrew its builders. The quarry is home to two staggering blocks of limestone. The first is the famous Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a name from local folklore. It is truly colossal, measuring about 69 feet long, with a weight scholars estimate at nearly 1,000 tons. It sits at a slight angle, partially separated from the bedrock, but just a short distance away. In the 1990s, archaeologists discovered an even larger monster. This block, still mostly attached to the quarry floor, is estimated to be 64 feet long, 19 feet wide, and over 18 feet high. Its calculated weight is a staggering 1,650 tons. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than a fully loaded jumbo jet. The presence of these blocks changes the entire story of Baalbek. The finished temple, for all its grandeur, represents the limit of what the Romans could actually accomplish. The quarry, however, shows us what they dreamed of accomplishing. It is a site of scaled ambition. The engineers, after successfully moving the 800-ton trilithon stones, seem to have asked a simple, daring question. How much bigger can we go? They began extracting blocks that were more than twice the mass, pushing the envelope of their own legendary capabilities. But then the work stopped. The larger block was never fully cut free. The reasons are not recorded, but we can read them in the stone itself. The logistical challenge of moving a 1,600-ton block would have been exponentially greater than anything they had done before. It would have required a complete re-engineering of their transport systems, new roads of unimaginable strength, and levers, ropes, and manpower on a scale that might have drained the treasury of the entire province. Perhaps during the attempt, a critical crack appeared, dooming the stone just like in Aswan. Or perhaps, after years of effort, a pragmatic governor or a new emperor simply looked at the ever-mounting cost and the slow pace and decided the marginal gain in glory was not worth the certain ruin of the treasury. The Baalbek quarry is therefore a different kind of abandonment. It is not a project halted by catastrophe or conquest, but by a cold, calculated reassessment. It represents the moment when ambition met the hard ceiling of practical reality. The Romans were the greatest engineers of the ancient world, yet here, they finally encountered a problem their ingenuity could not solve at a cost their empire was willing to pay. They walked away from these mountain-sized stones, leaving them as permanent residents of the quarry, a testament to the dreams that are sometimes too heavy even for an empire to carry. The quarry at Baalbek is a museum of ambition's limits. To understand why the Romans left their largest stones behind, we must first dismiss the simplest explanation. This was not a sudden collapse of the empire or a violent end to the project. The magnificent temple of Jupiter was completed and stood for centuries, a crown jewel of Roman religious architecture. The abandonment in the quarry is something more subtle, a strategic retreat from the very edge of the possible. The evidence points to a quiet, pragmatic decision made by engineers who finally met a problem they could not solve with the tools they had. They had mastered the movement of 800-ton blocks, a titanic achievement. But a stone weighing over 1,600 tons was not just bigger, it was a different category of problem entirely. Think of it not as moving a heavier weight, but as confronting a new law of physics. The friction against the ground, the strength of the ropes, the stability of the transport sledge, the integrity of the roadbed, every single variable scaled up in a non-linear, terrifying way. A rope that could hold 800 tons would snap under 1,600. A wooden roller that could bear the first weight would splinter into dust under the second. The existing technology, a masterpiece of human ingenuity, had simply reached its ceiling. This was a logistical nightmare of unimaginable proportions. To move such a stone, even a single foot would have required an army of laborers, not just hundreds, but perhaps many thousands, coordinated with impossible precision. The road from the quarry to the temple site would have needed to be rebuilt entirely, a highway of stone and packed earth with a foundation deeper than any yet constructed, just to prevent the ground from buckling under the concentrated mass. The process would have been agonizingly slow, perhaps just inches per day, consuming the province's entire workforce and treasury for years on end for one single block. And the risk of catastrophic failure was ever present. If the stone shifted unexpectedly or a crucial component failed, it could crush scores of workers and become permanently, irrecoverably stuck. At some point, a project manager or a visiting imperial official had to look at the situation and perform a brutal calculation. The cost in money, time, and human life to move these two megastones was simply too high for the additional prestige they would bring. The glory of the finished temple was already assured. The marginal return on this final, insane effort was effectively zero, so they did the rational thing. They scaled back. The completed temple of Jupiter, for all its grandeur, is actually the scaled-down version of the original dream. The builders pivoted from the impossible blocks to the merely colossal ones, the 800-ton trilithon stones they knew they could handle. The largest monoliths were left in the quarry not as failures but as permanent benchmarks. They are the physical manifestation of a line in the sand drawn by reality itself. This introduces a key concept we can call ambition scaling. It is a quiet, non-catastrophic reason for abandonment that is just as powerful as any invasion or natural disaster. It occurs when the vision outpaces the practical means to achieve it. The dream is not shattered by an external blow, but gently set aside by the sober minds who have to execute it. The Romans at Baalbek did not run out of will or wealth. They ran out of viable engineering solutions. They chose to finish a wonder of the world rather than die trying to build a slightly more wonderful one. This reveals a profound truth about these ancient megaprojects. They were not just acts of devotion or power. They were colossal experiments in logistics and material science. Each one tested the current state of knowledge to its absolute breaking point. And sometimes the most rational, successful outcome was to leave the biggest stone of all right where it lay, a silent teacher for future generations about the price of reaching for the impossible. But what happens when the force that stops construction is not a limit of engineering, but a fundamental shift in the very beliefs that motivated it? When the gods themselves are replaced, in the flat, sun-scorched plains of modern Iraq, a solitary mountain of earth and mud brick rises against the horizon. This is the Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu, a monument to a kingdom you have likely never heard of, built by the Kassite dynasty over 3,000 years ago. Unlike the stone giants of Egypt or Peru, this structure was built from the very land itself, formed from millions of sun-dried mud bricks into a massive stepped pyramid that served as a sacred bridge between earth and heaven. From a distance, it still commands the landscape, a towering silhouette, but up close, the story changes. The surface is deeply eroded, scarred by centuries of wind and rain into a soft, crumbling facade. And here, archaeologists found the telltale signs of a dream interrupted. The core of the ziggurat is built with those simple, sun-dried mud bricks, a practical and strong material for internal structure. But for the final, glorious exterior, the Kassite builders intended a skin of fired, glazed bricks. These baked bricks are virtually impervious to the elements, capable of being colored and gleaming in the desert sun, turning the structure into a radiant, symbolic beacon. Excavations revealed that this final, protective cladding was never applied. Piles of prepared kiln-fired bricks have been found at the site, but they were never set into place. The ziggurat was left in its rough, vulnerable state, its earthen heart exposed to the centuries. This was not an act of later vandalism or decay from use. This is evidence of work abandoned. The builders completed the monumental mass of the structure, then stopped before giving it its finished, eternal face. This half-dressed giant sits at the center of what was once a flourishing capital city, Dur-Kurigalzu, named for the Kassite king who established it. In its time, this was a place of palaces, temples, and economic power, a statement of Kassite authority in the region. Yet, not long after its construction began, both the city and the kingdom faded into profound obscurity, eventually buried by the sands until archaeologists rediscovered it millennia later. The unfinished cladding of the ziggurat is a direct physical symptom of that fade into silence. So what happened? Why would a powerful kingdom, having invested the immense labor to pile an artificial mountain of bricks, fail to take the final, crucial step to protect its investment for the ages? The answer lies not in a single crack or invading army, but in a slower, more insidious kind of vanishing. The mud brick ziggurat stands as a monument to a slow, quiet fade into history. The Kassite kingdom's story is not one of a dramatic, single collapse, but of a gradual dimming, like a lamp running out of oil. Their power, which once stretched across Mesopotamia, began to wane due to a confluence of pressures that slowly starved a grand project like Dur-Kurigalzu of its essential fuel. One of the most critical factors was the shifting landscape of trade. The Kassites had benefited from controlling key routes and engaging in prosperous exchange with neighboring powers like Egypt and the Hittites. Over time, these routes changed. New political entities arose, conflicts disrupted the steady flow of goods, and the economic lifeblood that sustained the kingdom's coffers began to thin. A royal treasury strained by the costs of maintaining influence and defense has little left to fund the baking and laying of millions of glazed bricks. Regional conflicts further drained resources. Mesopotamia was never a peaceful place, and the Kassites faced persistent pressure from rival kingdoms like Assyria to the north and Elam to the east. These were not always massive, war-ending invasions, but a constant series of border skirmishes, raids, and diplomatic tensions that demanded constant military expenditure. Every soldier paid, every weapon forged, was a resource diverted from the brickyards and construction crews at the capital. There is also compelling evidence from climatology that suggests this period saw increased aridity and drought in the region. For an agricultural society, a series of poor harvests is an economic and social catastrophe. It means less tax revenue for the state, less food for a concentrated labor force, and a population more focused on survival than on monumental construction. The king's attention would have been urgently pulled toward managing scarcity and maintaining basic order, not toward completing the decorative skin of a temple tower. This is the essence of a slow-motion abandonment. There was likely no official decree to stop work on the ziggurat. Instead, the energy simply bled away. The project slowed from a steady march to a halting walk, then to a standstill. The skilled artisans might have been reassigned to more urgent tasks, or their wages might have gone unpaid until they drifted away to find work elsewhere. The administrative machinery that coordinated the delivery of materials, the feeding of workers, and the supervision of construction gradually ground down, its gears clogged by more immediate crises. One season, the brick kilns fell cold and were never relit. The piles of finished, glazed bricks were left where they sat, slowly being buried by wind-blown dust, waiting for a final phase that the kingdom no longer had the strength to initiate. The unfinished ziggurat, therefore, is a geological layer of political and economic fatigue. Its exposed mud brick core is a direct reflection of a state whose central power was eroding just as surely as its monument was. The building did not fail, the kingdom that conceived it did, not with a bang but with a long, weary sigh. This pattern forces us to expand our understanding of why these projects halt. It is not always a crack in the stone or an army at the gates. Sometimes it is a slow leak of purpose, a draining away of the collective will and capacity that turns a sacred duty into a forgotten luxury. And this raises a final, profound category of abandonment, one where the project is not just physically unfinished, but where its very meaning is left incomplete, severed from the culture that gave it birth. The unfinished ziggurat shows a kingdom fading from within, its purpose slowly evaporating. But sometimes the end of a dream arrives with a single, personal event, as sudden and final as a candle being snuffed out. On the banks of the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar, a different kind of giant slumbers. This is the Mingun Pagoda, an early 19th century monument that defies belief. It is not a ruin from antiquity, but its story is so powerfully relevant to our theme that it demands inclusion. Here, the scale of ambition is almost incomprehensible. King Baalbek of the Konbaung dynasty envisioned constructing the largest pagoda in the world, a brick mountain meant to reach a height of 500 feet. Today, all that stands is its colossal, truncated base, a solid mass of brickwork 150 feet tall. To stand before it is to feel dwarfed not by age, but by sheer, arrested ambition. The base alone is a titanic achievement. The masonry platform covers an area larger than a modern city block, and the walls at its base are over 50 feet thick, a fortress of devotion. The bricks were bound together not with simple mortar, but with a specially formulated mix that included sticky rice and tree sap, creating a concrete-like bond of legendary strength. The scale of the logistics boggles the mind. Thousands of workers, elephants, and barges were marshaled for decades, hauling materials and laying an estimated tens of millions of bricks. This was not just a building project, it was the entire economic and spiritual focus of a kingdom, a single man's vision made manifest through the labor of a nation. The pagoda was meant to be the ultimate act of Buddhist merit, a deed so grand it would secure the king's legacy for eternity. And then, in the year 1819, everything stopped. The king died. With the passing of Baalbek, the driving force behind the entire endeavor vanished overnight. The project was his personal obsession, his sacred charge. His successors, facing the staggering cost and the immense practical challenges of continuing, made a pragmatic decision. They left the pagoda as it was, a monumental stump. A small temple was later built upon its vast terrace, a tiny jewel perched on a plateau of unrealized potential. The Mingun Pagoda is therefore the clearest possible example of a megastructure halted by what we might call the mortality of vision. It demonstrates that even in a powerful, stable kingdom with all the necessary resources and labor, a project of this magnitude can be entirely dependent on the will of one individual. The bricks and mortar were strong, but the dream was fragile, tied to a single human lifespan. This introduces a fascinating layer to our understanding. It shows that the vulnerability of these ancient projects wasn't just in their stone or their economies, but sometimes in the very person who commanded them into being. The site is not a tale of engineering failure or societal collapse, but of a legacy interrupted. It raises a haunting, universal question. How many of the world's great wonders only exist because the person who dreamed them up lived long enough to see them through? And how many more, like this silent brick mountain in Myanmar, remain only as hints of what might have been, frozen at the moment their creator departed the world? The Mingun Pagoda is a monument to a single man's will. King Baalbek did not merely commission this project, he embodied it. His personal ambition for spiritual merit and his desire for an eternal legacy were the twin engines that powered decades of labor. Every brick laid was a direct extension of his command, funded by the royal treasury he controlled absolutely. In such a system, the project's lifeblood was not just stone and mortar, but the king's own breath. When he passed, that vital force was extinguished in an instant. The complex machinery of state that had been entirely devoted to the pagoda's construction suddenly had no central operator. The royal accountants, the foremen, the barge captains all found themselves without their primary directive. the new king, faced with the staggering reality of continuing his predecessor's obsession, saw a bottomless pit of expense for a project that held no personal meaning for him. The funding and royal attention simply evaporated, redirected toward the new ruler's own priorities and the practical needs of governing a kingdom. This abrupt shift reveals a fundamental weakness in patronage-driven megastructures. They are only as stable as the patron who champions them. A change in leadership, especially in a system where power is so centralized, can rewrite a nation's entire architectural destiny overnight. Adding to this practical halt was a powerful undercurrent of belief. Local tradition held a haunting prophecy that the kingdom itself would fall on the very day the Great Pagoda was completed. This was not a trivial superstition, but a deeply held cultural narrative that wove the structure's fate directly into the survival of the state. For Baalbek, a ruler of immense confidence, this prophecy may have been a challenge to defy, a risk worth taking for unparalleled glory. But for his successors, it presented a terrifying dilemma. To finish the pagoda was not just to complete a building, it was to potentially invoke a curse upon the entire kingdom. In the face of such a belief, the decision to halt construction became not merely pragmatic, but possibly wise and protective. Why tempt fate by finishing a project that could spell your own end? This intertwining of prophecy and power shows us that the reasons for abandoning such sites were often layered. The visible cause might be a dead king and empty coffers, but beneath that could lie a profound cultural anxiety, a story so powerful it could freeze the hands of the builders themselves. The unfinished pagoda thus stands as a physical compromise between ambition and fear, between a king's dream and a people's dread. This pattern, the loss of the patron, is one of the most consistent threads running through the history of unfinished monuments. From pharaohs to emperors to kings, when the individual whose vision and authority greenlit a project disappears, the project itself enters a zone of extreme vulnerability. A new ruler inherits debts, not dreams. They inherit political challenges, not personal piety. The workforce, no longer compelled by the same royal command, disperses. The administrative focus shifts. What was once the central mission of the state becomes, at best, a secondary concern, and at worst, a symbol of a past regime to be quietly forgotten. Mingun's silent brick mountain is the textbook example, a case study in how the most colossal human endeavors can be brought to a standstill not by war or earthquake, but by the simple, inevitable passing of time and the change of heart it brings. It forces us to wonder how many other foundations were laid, how many other quarries opened that we will never know about because the king who ordered them died before the first stone was ever set. The death of a king could leave a mountain of bricks untouched, but in Egypt it left a pyramid forever changed. In the royal necropolis of Abusir, south of Giza, stands one of the most telling monuments of the 5th dynasty, the so-called Pyramid of Pharaoh Neferefre. To call it a pyramid, however, is a generous description. What you see today is a low, square massif of limestone core blocks, rising only about 20 feet high from a massive base. It looks less like a pyramid and more like a giant stone platform, a foundation for something that never arrived. This was not the original plan. Archaeological excavations have revealed the truth. Neferefre, who ascended the throne as a very young man, began construction on a true, smooth-sided pyramid intended to be his eternal resting place. The workers laid out the gigantic square base and began piling the core masonry, building upwards in the traditional manner. Then, suddenly, the work stopped. The pharaoh died unexpectedly, probably in his early 20s, after a reign of only a few short years. The pyramid was barely begun, with only the lowest layers of its inner core completed. The ancient Egyptian state was then faced with a profound dilemma. A pharaoh could not be left without a proper tomb, a sacred vessel for his journey to the afterlife. Yet the monumental pyramid he had started was now an impossible task to complete in time for his burial rites. the solution was a fascinating act of architectural pragmatism. The builders did not abandon the site. Instead, they radically changed the blueprint. They took the low, square mass of stone they had already built and finished it off with a flat top, converting it into a giant mastaba, a bench-shaped tomb. They then hastily constructed a small mortuary temple against its eastern side. What we see at Abusir is therefore a hybrid, a building caught between two identities. It is a pyramid forever trapped in its infancy, hastily adapted into a different form to serve an urgent need. The stones tell a clear story of a timeline shattered. The quality of the masonry in the hurriedly completed sections is noticeably rougher than in the original core. The entire complex feels compressed and improvised, a dignified but rushed solution to a royal crisis. Neferefre's unfinished pyramid is a masterclass in reading ancient priorities through stone. It shows that for the Egyptians, the function of the tomb, its sacred purpose, was non-negotiable. The form, however, could be adapted to reality. This site gives us a rare glimpse into the contingency planning of an ancient civilization. When the divine king died ahead of schedule, the engineers and priests did not simply walk away. They pivoted, they salvaged the work already done and repurposed it with impressive speed. Yet, in doing so, they left us a permanent record of that pivotal moment. The structure is a direct cast of a political and biological event, the untimely death of a ruler. It proves that even in a society as meticulously ordered as Old Kingdom Egypt, with its deep traditions and seemingly endless resources, the greatest plans could be undone by the simple, unpredictable nature of human life. The monument stands not as a failure, but as a testament to adaptability in the face of a broken timeline. A pyramid that became something else so a pharaoh could still become a god. The stone platform at Abusir is a testament to a broken calendar. Pharaoh Neferefre's untimely passing did more than just halt construction. It triggered a state of emergency for the entire funerary priesthood. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh's burial was not a singular event. It was the culmination of a meticulously scheduled cosmic process. His pyramid was his vehicle to eternity, and its construction was meant to mirror the length and stability of his reign. A long rule meant a grand, perfectly finished tomb. A short one, like Neferefre's, created an impossible crisis. The massive stone base was already laid, a promise to the gods carved into the desert floor, but the timeline to complete a true pyramid had just evaporated. The result was not abandonment, but a frantic architectural salvage operation. The builders looked at that 20-foot-high core of limestone and saw not an unfinished pyramid, but the foundation for a solution. They finished it with a flat top, creating a giant mastaba, and rushed to build the essential mortuary temple beside it. The difference in stonework is telling. The original core blocks are carefully set, but the upper courses and the temple walls are noticeably rougher, built with speed, not eternity, in mind. This site reveals a rigid, unspoken rule of these mega-projects. Their construction schedule was a direct reflection of a single human heartbeat. The entire colossal machine of quarrying, transporting, and stacking stone was geared to a timeline that could stop without warning. Contrast this with the Ziggurat at Dur-Kurigalzu. There, the work faded slowly over generations, starved by dwindling trade and shifting priorities. The Kassite builders had time, but they lost the will and means. At Abusir, the will was absolute. The pharaoh had to have a tomb, but time itself ran out. The builders there had all the resources and motivation of a powerful state, yet they were forced into a compromise, forever freezing the moment a young king's life ended too soon. This is abandonment through sudden, biological reality. It shows that even the most divine plans could be scrambled by mortality, leaving behind a structure that is both a dignified tomb and a permanent record of a timeline cut tragically short. Far to the east, where the Oxus River meets the Kokcha, a Greek city once dreamed in the dust of Afghanistan. This was Ai-Khanoum, the Alexandria of the Oxus, a startling outpost of Hellenistic culture founded in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest. For nearly 2 centuries, from the late 4th to the 2nd century before the Common Era, it thrived as a vibrant fusion of worlds. Here, a classical Greek theater looked out over the Central Asian steppe. A gymnasium trained young men in both athletics and philosophy, while temples blended Greek deities with Eastern spiritual ideas. At the heart of this cosmopolitan experiment stood its most ambitious feature, a sprawling palace complex that was the administrative and symbolic core of the city. This was not a single static building, but a living organ of power constantly being modified, expanded, and adapted. And within its walls, archaeologists have found a chronicle of rising anxiety, written in half-finished walls and hurried fortifications. The palace tells a story not of a single moment of abandonment, but of a prolonged, desperate struggle to keep a dream alive against gathering shadows. The original palace was a grand compound with columned courtyards, elaborate reception halls, and administrative offices, all laid out in a Hellenistic plan. But as you examine the ruins, the narrative shifts. Clear, later phases of construction show the rulers of Ai-Khanoum initiating a major expansion. New wings were begun, foundations were laid, and walls started to rise. Yet in several key areas, this work was never completed. The masonry simply stops. In other sections, the story grows more urgent. Rather than finishing elegant new apartments, the builders suddenly changed tactics. They began to reinforce existing walls, thickening them with crude brickwork. They blocked off once grand doorways and windows, turning parts of the luxurious palace into a makeshift fortress. This is the critical evidence. The palace shows 2 simultaneous and telling conditions: ambitious expansion abruptly halted, and existing spaces being hastily hardened for defense. This is the architecture of a society that is still functioning, still planning for a future, but one that is acutely aware of a looming threat. They were trying to grow their seat of power while simultaneously preparing it for a siege. The unfinished expansions and the panic-driven reinforcements point to a prolonged period of instability. Historians piece together a picture of increasing pressure on the Greco-Bactrian kingdom from nomadic confederations moving in from the northern steppes. These were not necessarily sudden, massive invasions, but a creeping tide of raids, political pressure, and disrupted trade routes. The palace at Ai-Khanoum became a barometer for this stress. The fact that expansion projects were started indicates that the city's rulers initially felt secure enough and wealthy enough to invest in grand displays of their enduring power. But the fact that those projects were left incomplete, while resources were suddenly diverted to building defensive walls inside the palace itself, signals a dramatic and rapid shift in priorities. The dream of cultural flourishing and monumental growth collided with a stark new reality of survival. The builders dropped their decorative stonework and picked up rubble and mud brick to shore up their defenses. Every blocked window speaks of a community turning inward, sacrificing light and grace for security. Ultimately, the reinforcements were not enough. Sometime around the year 145 before the Common Era, Ai-Khanoum fell. The palace was looted and put to the torch. The destruction layer found by archaeologists is stark and conclusive. Yet, the most poignant testimony is not in the final layer of ash, but in the phases just beneath it. The unfinished halls and the thickened walls tell of a long, tense twilight. This is not a city that was surprised in a single raid. It is a city that saw the storm coming, that tried to adapt, to fortify, and to maintain its way of life even as the world closed in. The palace at Ai-Khanoum, therefore, represents a different category of unfinished megastructure. It is not a project stopped by a crack in stone or the death of a king, but by a slow external pressure that eventually became overwhelming. It is a monument to resilience that ultimately became a record of a fragile frontier, a place where Greek columns and Eastern artistry made a final, defiant stand before being reclaimed by the dust of the steppe. This pattern of a frontier collapsing under sustained pressure makes us wonder, could a megastructure be abandoned not because of a threat, but because of a profound, internal change of faith? The unfinished palace at Ai-Khanoum is a blueprint of fear. You can trace the city's final decades not in scrolls, but in its altered stonework. Initially, the grand expansion projects spoke of confidence, a belief that this Greek city on the edge of the known world had a permanent future. Architects laid out new foundations for lavish wings, and masons began raising elegant walls. But then, the rhythm of construction changed. The precise, squared blocks gave way to rushed, uneven work. The builders stopped finishing the new halls and instead turned their labor inward, piling thick layers of crude mud brick against the palace's existing outer walls. They bricked up graceful colonnades and sealed off spacious windows, transforming airy courtyards into defensive strongpoints. Every modification was a tactical retreat, a sacrifice of beauty and openness for the grim necessity of security. This was not a sudden decision, but a gradual, desperate recalibration. The resources, the skilled labor, the timber, the funds were steadily pulled away from civic ambition and poured into survival. The dream of a growing Hellenistic capital was being choked by the daily reality of a frontier under siege. The pressure came from the vast steppes to the north, the domain of nomadic confederations whose movements were as unpredictable as the wind. For years, it might have been a tension, a series of distant raids on trade caravans or outlying settlements. But the evidence in the stone tells us the threat grew closer, more personal. The city's leaders were not just preparing for a possible attack, they were actively fortifying their administrative heart because they believed an attack was inevitable. The palace, the very symbol of their cultural and political order, was being converted into a final redoubt. And then the end came. Archaeological evidence points to a violent fall around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. There are signs of intense conflict, of buildings put to the torch, and of a swift, thorough looting. The city was not slowly abandoned, it was overrun. The half-finished expansion wings were never completed, forever frozen as frames of a future that would never arrive. The hastily built inner fortifications proved insufficient against the final assault. Ai-Khanoum presents perhaps the clearest archetype of a megastructure halted by an imminent, existential threat. This was not a slow economic fade or a change in religious belief. This was a direct, physical danger that first consumed all creative energy for defense, and then consumed the city itself. The unfinished palace is therefore a powerful historical document. It captures that precarious moment when a society shifts from building for tomorrow to simply fighting to see the dawn. It reminds us that the most profound limits on human ambition are sometimes not made of stone or distance, but of other humans moving with a different dream across the horizon. The steppe's pressure could shatter a frontier city, but in the heart of a wealthy kingdom, a different kind of endless project took shape. In ancient Lydia, a land famed for its gold-rich rivers and the invention of coinage itself, the people began a temple worthy of a goddess and a king. The temple of Artemis at Sardis was conceived on a staggering scale, intended to be one of the largest Greek-style temples ever built, rivaling even the Parthenon in Athens. Its foundation platform alone stretches over 300 feet in length, a vast rectangle of stone meant to support a forest of columns. This was not a project born from crisis, but from immense prosperity and piety, a statement that the Lydian capital was a peer to the great cultural centers of the Mediterranean world. Yet, to walk among its ruins today is to witness a construction site that never closed. a project that stretched across centuries only to be left in a state of permanent, elegant incompletion. The story of this temple is written in the stones themselves, not in dramatic breaks, but in a slow, persistent whisper of ambition outpacing time. You can see it in the columns. Some stand tall and are exquisitely finished, with the vertical grooves known as fluting carved with masterful precision. But right beside them, other columns of identical size and placement remain in a rough, unfinished state. Their surfaces are still bumpy and irregular, bearing the marks of the quarry, never touched by the mason's final chisel. This side-by-side contrast is the key. It tells us that construction was not a continuous, focused effort, but a sporadic campaign that started, stopped, and restarted over generations. Different teams, perhaps centuries apart, worked on different parts of the structure, each leaving their own signature in the stone. The decorative elements tell a similar story. Elaborate moldings and sculptural reliefs were planned for the pediments and friezes, the crowning glory of any classical temple. At Sardis, you find the carefully prepared stone beds for these ornaments, the empty spaces waiting to receive their carved marble narratives. But in many cases, the sculptures themselves were never created or never installed. The temple was functionally complete enough to be used for worship. The altar was built and ceremonies were held, but it never received its final artistic polish, the breathtaking details that would have transformed it from a monumental building into a transcendent work of art. This pattern of sporadic work across centuries points to a complex reality. Sardis was a wealthy and powerful city, but it was also a prize, a strategic hub conquered successively by the Persians, the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. Each new wave of rulers might have taken an interest in the great temple, adding a few columns or repairing a section, but none seemed to have made its final completion a paramount, urgent priority. It became a perennial project, a civic backdrop that was always under a gentle state of construction. The resources and will were never fully withdrawn, but they were also never fully marshaled for a final, decisive push to the finish line. The temple at Sardis thus represents perhaps the most subtle form of abandonment. It was not stopped by catastrophe or conquest, but by a slow dilution of focus. It was a dream that became a tradition, a project so large it outlived the singular vision that began it, becoming instead a canvas for successive generations to add a touch, but never the final stroke. In its unfinished columns, we see not a failure, but the quiet rhythm of history itself, where even the grandest plans must sometimes learn to live with perpetual becoming. A monument can become so vast it enters a different relationship with time. The Temple of Artemis at Sardis was not abandoned in a single season of crisis, but through a slow, almost imperceptible process of institutional fatigue. Its construction began in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a project funded by the legendary wealth of the Lydian kings. But that kingdom and the specific vision of its rulers did not last. Sardis was conquered and then conquered again, passing through the hands of Persian satraps, Hellenistic generals, and Roman governors. With each change in power, the temple faced a new reality. It was still a sacred site, still a symbol of civic pride, but its completion was no longer the central, driving mission of the state. The original patron was gone. The original treasury was emptied or redirected. The project became a legacy item, a piece of unfinished business that each new administration inherited, but rarely prioritized. Imagine a relay race where the baton is passed, but each new runner is a little less invested in the final sprint. Work became sporadic, dependent on the fleeting interest or piety of a temporary ruler, or on the city's fluctuating fortunes. A wealthy Roman proconsul might fund a new row of columns to celebrate his term. A generation later, funds might dry up during a regional conflict, and the masons would down their tools, expecting to return when times were better. But better never quite aligned with the full momentum needed to cross the finish line. This is how a building outlives its own purpose. The cultural priorities shifted. For the Lydians, it was a statement of native power and devotion. For the Romans, it was one impressive temple among many in a vast empire, a local attraction to be maintained, but not necessarily completed at any cost. The temple transitioned stone by stone from an active construction site into a revered and functional ruin. It was used for worship for centuries, even in its unfinished state. The altar saw sacrifices, the people gathered in its shadow, yet the sculptors never filled the empty pediments with their planned marble dramas. There was no definitive stop date, no moment when a foreman declared the project over. Instead, the energy simply dissipated across the centuries like a fire dying to embers. This is abandonment by attenuation. The dream wasn't shattered, it was gently dissolved by the passing of generations, until the unfinished state itself became the temple's enduring identity, a permanent work in progress that finally conceded to time. Scattered across a Peruvian mountainside, a stone army lies in permanent retreat. High above the sacred Urubamba River Valley, the approach to the Inca fortress temple of Ollantaytambo is guarded by a legion of silent giants, colossal blocks of rose-red granite that seem to have been abandoned mid-step. They rest on steep slopes, perch precariously on stone ramps, and lie tumbled along ancient pathways. This is not a ruin of a building, but the frozen infrastructure of ambition itself, a transportation project of unimaginable scale that was simply left where it stopped. The fortress above is a masterpiece of Inca engineering, with its soaring terraces and precisely fitted walls. But the true story of its construction is told not on the summit, but on the brutal climb to reach it. The blocks here are not merely large, they are titanic. Some measure over 12 feet high and weigh more than 50 tons. They were quarried from a mountainside across the valley, a distance of several miles that involved a descent to the river, a crossing, and then a steep ascent of over 2,000 feet up the opposite slope to the construction site. The logistical challenge is breathtaking. The Incas had no wheels, no draft animals stronger than the llama, and no iron tools. Moving a single one of these stones would have been a generational feat for most cultures. To move dozens of them was an act of collective will that defies belief. The methods are still studied with awe. They likely used earthen ramps, levers, ropes woven from mountain grasses, and the raw power of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of laborers pulling in unison. The pathways themselves were engineering marvels, paved roads with stone sleepers and retaining walls to guide the monoliths on their journey. Yet, on the slopes below Ollantaytambo, that journey was never completed. The blocks were left in transit, some still resting on the stone sleepers meant to ease their passage, as if the workers simply set down their ropes one day and never returned. This site is unique among our unfinished megastructures. It is not a temple half-raised or a tomb hastily adapted. It is a snapshot of the most difficult phase of all, the moment of movement. These stones capture the immense, grinding effort that preceded construction, the phase most often erased from history once a building is complete. Their abandonment is a puzzle written across a landscape. Why, after successfully quarrying and moving these monsters across a river and partway up a mountain, would the Inca stop? The answer may lie not in the stones, but in the skyline and in the arrival of a storm that would change the Andes forever. The rose-red granite blocks rest where they fell, a stone traffic jam frozen for 5 centuries. This is the signature of a system in catastrophic failure. The prevailing explanation among historians points to a precise and devastating historical window. The period of the Inca Civil War followed immediately by the Spanish conquest. These were not years of slow decline, but a rapid, violent shattering of the world. The stones of Ollantaytambo were likely in transit during this very chaos. One can envision the highly organized teams of laborers, the mitre workers fulfilling their rotational duty to the state, straining in unison along these mountain paths. Their system was a masterpiece of centralized planning, where every rope, every ramp, every resting point was calculated. Then the empire fractured. Brother fought brother in a war of succession between Atahualpa and Huascar, draining manpower and focus from monumental projects to the urgent needs of warfare. The great logistical machine, which moved mountains literally, began to sputter, and then, before the dust of that conflict could even settle, an entirely alien force arrived. Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, entered the heart of the empire. With them came not only new weapons but unfamiliar illnesses that swept through populations with no immunity, causing profound loss and social disruption. In this storm of conflict and crisis, the orders from the central authority simply ceased. The workers on the slopes of Ollantaytambo would have received word, or more likely, a lack of word. The administrators who scheduled their labor, the engineers who directed the placement of each sleeper stone, the priests who sanctified the effort, all were suddenly consumed by a fight for survival. The workers, their communal purpose dissolved, would have dropped their ropes and returned to their homes, to protect their families or simply to wait for a clarity that would never return. The stones mid-journey became permanently stranded. This is why Ollantaytambo's abandoned transport route is such a uniquely powerful symbol. It does not show a design flaw or a lack of resources. It shows a sophisticated system operating at its peak, brought to an absolute, grinding halt by external forces it could not comprehend. The stones are not merely unfinished, they are interrupted. They capture the exact moment when an empire's grand vision for the future collided with a present that demanded everything. Their silent presence on those slopes is a monument to logistical power, yes, but even more so to its fragility. A civilization can carve mountains and command rivers, yet its most enduring legacy may sometimes be the things it was forced to leave behind, perfectly intact on the road to nowhere. These silent stones scattered across the world share a common language. By listening to their stories, we can begin to decipher the patterns of collapse, the recurring forces that brought the most ambitious human dreams to a standstill. The evidence from our journey reveals not random misfortune, but a sobering catalogue of vulnerabilities, a list of the ways even the mightiest civilizations can be humbled. We can group these causes into several clear and often intertwined categories. The first is technical failure as seen at Aswan. Here, the dream collided with the unyielding laws of the material world. A hidden crack in the granite, perhaps worsened by the extraction process itself, proved that ancient technology, while brilliant, operated at the very edge of the possible. There was no margin for error when pushing stone to its absolute limit. Then we have the force of political conquest and conflict, a thread that runs through Kuelap, Ai-Khanoum, and Ollantaytambo. In these cases, the unfinished structure is a direct casualty of war, invasion, or profound societal disruption. At Kuelap and Ollantaytambo, the builders themselves were displaced or consumed by larger conflicts, leaving their work literally in the hands of strangers or abandoned on the road. At Ai-Khanoum, we saw the architecture of anxiety, where a society shifted from building for its future to fortifying for its survival, until that survival itself became impossible. A third powerful pattern is the death of a patron, the loss of the singular will that drove the project. The Mingun Pagoda and Neferefre's pyramid are masterclasses in this. When King Bodopeya died, the spiritual and financial engine of the pagoda vanished overnight. For Pharaoh Neferefre, his untimely death forced a frantic, pragmatic redesign of his eternal home. These sites remind us that in highly centralized societies, a megastructure often had only one true champion, and its fate was tied to that individual's lifespan. Slower, but just as effective, is the grind of economic or imperial decline, perfectly illustrated by the Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu. Here, there was no sudden invasion or royal death, but a gradual erosion of trade, the strain of regional conflicts, and likely environmental pressures like drought. The state slowly bled the resources and focus needed for that final, glorious layer of cladding, leaving the monument's vulnerable heart exposed. Finally, we encounter the quiet surrender of logistical overreach at Baalbek. The Romans, the supreme engineers of their age, finally asked a question their technology could not answer. They discovered the hard ceiling of practical reality, where moving a stone twice as heavy was not twice as hard, but exponentially, ruinously impossible. The decision to leave the largest blocks in the quarry was a cold, rational calculation that ambition had finally outpaced executable method. The crucial insight, however, is that these causes are rarely solitary. They intertwine and amplify one another. A political conflict drains an economy which starves a project, making it vulnerable to technical shortcuts that lead to failure. The death of a patron can hasten imperial decline. What begins as logistical overreach can accelerate into economic strain. These unfinished sites are therefore not simple stories with one villain. They are complex ecosystems of stress, where a primary cause triggers a cascade of secondary failures, until the collective wilter continues simply dissipates. They teach us that the greatest threat to a civilization's monuments is rarely a single event, but a perfect storm of interconnected crises, where the stones are left as the final, silent witnesses to a dream unraveling from multiple directions at once. A megastructure was a living organism fed by 1,000 tiny veins. The true cost of these monuments was not measured in gold or stone alone, but in the silent, relentless flow of daily necessities that kept the dream alive. Imagine the scene at the height of construction. Thousands of workers, from skilled stonemasons to the laborers hauling ropes, required a constant, massive supply of food and clean water. Their families in nearby settlements needed shelter and support. The raw materials, whether limestone from a distant quarry or cedar wood from across the sea, depended on complex trade networks and fleets of transport ships. Overseeing it all was a vast, invisible bureaucracy of scribes, foremen, and quartermasters, tracking every chisel, every sack of grain, and every day of labor owed to the state. This was not a single expense, but a perpetual economic engine. If that engine faltered, even for a season, the entire project could shudder to a stop. The stones themselves might remain, but the human energy surrounding them would simply evaporate. A single drought in the farmlands that supplied the workers could trigger this collapse. Suddenly, the grain stores earmarked for the construction crews are needed to feed the general population. The state faces a brutal choice: feed its people or feed its monument. The monument loses. Similarly, a blocked trade route could be catastrophic. If copper from Cyprus could not reach Egypt, the stonemason's tools could not be repaired or replaced. If a key source of timber was cut off by conflict, the ramps and scaffolding essential for raising columns could not be built. The project did not need to be attacked to be crippled. It could be starved from a distance. Even the diversion of the army, the state's ultimate enforcer and often a source of captive labor, could unravel years of planning. If soldiers were urgently needed to quell a rebellion on a distant frontier, the security and logistical pressure they provided on a remote construction site vanished. The administrative focus, the royal priority, shifted overnight from eternal glory to immediate survival. This resource drain reveals a critical truth. These projects were not built from surplus, they were built from sovereignty. They required a stable, functioning, and confident state capable of marshalling and protecting a river of resources for decades. Any rupture in that stability, any leak in those vital veins, meant the work slowed, then stalled, and was often never restarted. The unfinished state of a ziggurat or a temple foundation is frequently the first physical symptom of a kingdom's illness. a sign that its economic body could no longer sustain its most ambitious dreams. Long before an empire fell, its greatest buildings stopped growing. The stones could only be moved if the land itself was willing to cooperate. While political upheaval and broken supply chains are visible in the archaeological record, a more silent and pervasive force often lurked in the background of these collapses, the slow, relentless pressure of a changing environment. The climate itself could become an invisible architect of abandonment, not always by delivering a single catastrophic event, but by gradually turning the world against the builder's grandest plans. Across the globe, from the jungles of Central America to the river valleys of North America, we see a recurring pattern where environmental stress acts as a powerful amplifier, squeezing the resources and stability that monumental construction demands. The great Maya cities, for instance, did not fall in a single season of war. Decades of research point to a series of intense and prolonged droughts that stretched over centuries, placing unbearable strain on their water-dependent agricultural systems. As crop yields fell and reservoirs dried, the social contract that compelled thousands to labor on towering temples and palaces began to fray. The energy required to manage survival simply left no surplus for cosmic construction. Similarly, the mighty city of Cahokia, which flourished along the Mississippi River with its vast plazas and enormous earthen mounds, appears to have faced a similar environmental reckoning. A period of cooler, wetter weather in the 13th and 14th centuries, followed by significant flooding, likely disrupted the agricultural base that supported its dense population. When the land can no longer reliably feed the people can no longer build for the gods. For the specific sites we have explored, direct, singular proof of environmental catastrophe as the final blow is often elusive in the stones themselves. Yet, it is almost impossible to imagine it was not a contributing factor, a constant, grinding pressure in the background. Consider the Ziggurat at Dur-Kurigalzu in a region prone to drought, or the logistical nightmare of feeding thousands at Ollantaytambo in the variable Andean climate. A series of poor harvests would not just mean hunger, it would mean the state's grain reserves, earmarked for the workforce, would evaporate. The administrators would be forced to choose, feed the builders or send them home. They would send them home, the quarry at Baalbek, the palace at Ai-Khanoum, even the foundations in Egypt, all relied on complex agricultural hinterlands and stable water sources to sustain their human engines. A shift in rainfall patterns, a change in river flow, or the depletion of local resources like timber for fuel and construction could introduce a constant, draining friction into the system. This environmental strain rarely acts alone. Instead, it weaves itself into the other causes, making a political crisis more desperate, an economic shortfall more acute, and a logistical overreach utterly impossible. It is the slow leak that eventually sinks the ship. A king might withstand a rebellion, but can he withstand a rebellion during a 10-year drought? An empire might finance a new temple wing, but can it do so when its tax base is withering in the fields? The unfinished monuments, therefore, stand as possible sentinels not just of human conflict, but of a deeper, older conflict between civilization and the natural world. They remind us that the most ambitious dreams are built upon a foundation of ecological consent, a consent that can be withdrawn, season by difficult season, until the last chisel is set down and the workers walk back to a land that can no longer support their grandest vision. The divine blueprint was always clear, but the world was not. For the rulers and priests of the ancient world, constructing a temple or a tomb was never merely an architectural project. It was a sacred contract, a non-negotiable duty to the gods and the cosmic order. A pharaoh built his pyramid to secure his passage to the afterlife and ensure the sun would rise. A Mesopotamian king raised a ziggurat to create a literal stairway to heaven, a meeting point between the human and the divine. In Mesoamerica, each layer of a temple pyramid was an act of renewal, a ritual repetition of creation itself. This was the ultimate religious imperative, a command from the universe that demanded obedience in stone. The workforce was not just labor, it was a congregation. The resources were not just taxes, they were offerings. To build was to pray on a civilization-wide scale. Yet this profound spiritual drive existed within a fragile vessel, the practical reality of a state that needed to feed its people, defend its borders, and maintain stability. The unfinished sites we have explored are the archaeological evidence of the moment when that vessel cracked. They are the physical tipping point where an unavoidable earthly crisis forced a society to make an impossible choice, to temporarily suspend its dialogue with the gods in order to address the screaming needs of the present. Imagine the council of priests and engineers in a time of encroaching drought. The granaries are half empty, and the people in the workers' settlement are growing restless. The high priest argues that to halt construction on the sun god's temple is to risk the harvest entirely, to invite the god's wrath. The royal treasurer counters that if the workers starve or revolt, there will be no one left to build anything for any god. This was the brutal calculus of survival. At places like Dur-Kurigalzu, we see the outcome. The choice was made, perhaps reluctantly, to redirect grain from the brickyards to the villages. The divine project was paused with every intention of resuming when the rains returned, but sometimes the crisis did not end. The pause became a permanent silence. The half-clad ziggurat stands as a monument to that terrible decision, a choice to preserve the living body of the kingdom at the potential cost of its eternal soul. This conflict reveals a core truth about these civilizations. Their ideology was built for eternity, but their logistics were built for a stable, predictable world. When that predictability shattered, the ideology faced its ultimate test. Could faith itself move mountains if there was no bread to feed the people pushing them? The unfinished stones suggest that, in the direst hours, even the most devout societies had to listen to the immediate cries of their people over the eternal call of their gods. They chose the community of the present over the legacy of the future, a pragmatic survival instinct that, ironically, often doomed the very legacy they sought to protect. In that suspended state between divine command and human need, the dream of eternity was left waiting, forever captured in a field of half-raised columns. For centuries, these abandoned stones could only whisper fragments of their story. Today, we are finally learning to listen. Modern archaeology has transformed from a careful study of visible ruins into a high-resolution science capable of peering through earth and time, turning silent fields of debris into vivid narratives of crisis. The key lies in a suite of technologies that act as extensions of our senses, allowing us to map the invisible and date the undatable. At the forefront is LiDAR, a laser scanning system typically mounted on aircraft. By bathing a jungle or a rugged landscape in millions of laser pulses, LiDAR can strip away the dense canopy or surface vegetation to reveal the human-made topography beneath. This technology has been revolutionary in places like the Maya lowlands, where it has exposed vast networks of causeways, reservoirs, and agricultural fields surrounding known cities. For unfinished sites, LiDAR can reveal the full, intended scope of a project. It might show the ghostly outline of a foundation trench that was dug but never filled, or the precise grid of a workers' settlement that was suddenly evacuated, giving us the true scale of the dream before it was interrupted. Equally powerful is ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. Instead of looking down from above, this method sends radar pulses into the earth from the surface. As these pulses bounce off buried features like walls, voids, or different soil layers, they create a detailed subsurface map. At a site like the unfinished ziggurat, GPR could help archaeologists locate those stockpiles of fired bricks that were never used, still buried where they were left. It can trace the unfinished foundation of a temple wall that disappears beneath the soil, showing exactly how far construction progressed before halting. This allows researchers to distinguish between a project that was barely started and one that was nearly complete, a crucial difference in understanding the timing and severity of the crisis. Beyond mapping, science provides a way to read the environmental diary kept within the stones and soil themselves. Isotopic analysis is a method of examining the chemical signatures trapped in materials. By studying oxygen isotopes in ancient layers of lakebed sediment or in the growth rings of preserved timber, scientists can reconstruct past climate patterns with remarkable precision. They can identify decades of severe drought or periods of unusual rainfall. When this climatic data is layered onto the archaeological timeline of a site's abandonment, it can reveal whether environmental stress was a silent partner in the collapse. Did a series of poor harvests revealed in the chemical record coincide with the moment the workers downed their tools at that massive pyramid? This kind of correlation turns a guess into a supported hypothesis. Similarly, isotopic analysis of human remains from workers' cemeteries can tell us about diet and health. A sudden shift in nutrition or evidence of widespread illness at the time of abandonment can point to a societal breakdown that made continued construction impossible. These tools do more than just collect data, they weave it into a story. A LiDAR map shows the planned city, GPR reveals the unfinished foundation, and isotopic analysis from a nearby lake core confirms a generations-long drought began at the same time. Together, they transform a collection of puzzling ruins into a coherent scene. We can now see not just that a society stopped building, but we can often understand the converging pressures that forced that agonizing decision. The stones no longer just mark where the work ended, they help us reconstruct the world that crumbled around the builders, allowing their unfinished legacy to finally speak in complete sentences. A finished monument declares a civilization's triumph, but an unfinished one reveals its humanity. These abandoned sites are not failures of imagination or will, they are the most honest history books we possess, written in half-cut stone and interrupted foundations. Where a polished pyramid hides the sweat and struggle of its creation, a quarry with a cracked obelisk lays bare the brutal physics of ambition. We learn more from the ramp left leaning against a half-built wall than from the perfect facade it was meant to create. These places teach us about ancient problem-solving in real time, showing the ingenious adaptations and the heartbreaking miscalculations. They showcase vulnerability, a quality so often erased from the official records of kings and emperors. In their silent, suspended state, they confess that even the most powerful societies faced impossible choices, unforeseen cracks, and forces beyond their control. They are permanent reminders etched across the globe that no civilization, however grand its temples or vast its empire, operates outside of time or immune to disruption. This is their profound legacy. They challenge the simplistic story of inevitable rise and fall, replacing it with a mosaic of specific, relatable crises: a bad harvest here, a flawed stone there, a king's untimely passing, a distant war that pulled resources away. They show collapse not as a mysterious event, but as a process, often a slow accumulation of stresses until the final, fragile balance was lost. For us today, they offer a strange kind of solace. In a world that often feels fragile, seeing that the giants of the past also struggled against uncertainty is a humbling and connecting thought. These sites tell us that reaching for the impossible is a defining human trait, but so is the reality of limits. They were not abandoned out of a lack of vision, but because the world, in all its complexity, intervened. Their enduring power lies in this unresolved tension. They hold a question forever in their stones, a question about the cost of greatness and the price of a dream. By studying them, we do not just learn about ancient engineering or forgotten kings, we engage in a conversation across millennia about resilience, hubris, and the delicate threads that hold a society together. They remind us that history is not only made by what was completed, but profoundly shaped by what was left behind, waiting forever for a tomorrow that never came. The silent stones scattered across the globe tell a unified story of fragile systems. These megastructures did not stop out of whim or a simple loss of interest. They halted when the intricate, interlocking web that sustained them political stability, economic surplus, environmental consent, and ideological certainty finally fractured under an unbearable weight of pressure. Each site is a unique snapshot of that breaking point, a historical turning point captured in granite and limestone. The Unfinished Obelisk is a portrait of technological limits. The stranded blocks of Ollantaytambo are a fossil of logistical collapse. The half-clad ziggurat is a monument to economic erosion. Together, they form a gallery of vulnerability, revealing that the grandest human dreams are built upon foundations far more delicate than stone. This drive to build monumentally, to reach beyond our grasp and leave a mark that defies time, is one of humanity's oldest and most defining impulses. We see it in every culture, in every age. The unfinished wonders are perhaps the purest expression of that impulse because they are uncensored by final success. They show the ambition raw without the smoothing polish of completion. In their interrupted state, they connect us more intimately to the past than any perfect temple ever could. We see not just the glory our ancestors achieved, but the struggles they faced, the crises they could not overcome, and the heartbreaking choices they were forced to make. They remind us that history is not a parade of inevitable victories, but a record of perseverance in the face of the unpredictable. So the next time you see an image of a lone column standing in a field or a massive block forever resting in its quarry, look closer. You are not looking at a failure. You are looking at a moment frozen in time, a conversation between a civilization and its limits. These places are open questions etched into the earth, asking us to consider the cost of our own ambitions. They are a legacy of dreams interrupted, and in that they are profoundly, powerfully human. We would love to hear which of these unfinished wonders resonates most with you. Is it the solitary giant in the Egyptian desert, the stone army on the Peruvian slopes, or the silent palace in the Afghan plains? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us continue the conversation across the centuries.